My name is Homer, and at 68 years old, I never thought my own son would betray me like this. Standing in my living room, Frank handed me a check for $10,000 with a smug smile. I sold your apartment for $1 million. This is your share. Enough to buy a room in some dump in the outskirts, he announced. I took the check, looked at it, and laughed. He had no idea what I had done just days before. If you are watching this, drop a comment telling me where you are from, and subscribe to hear more stories about family betrayal. I spent 40 years of my life as an architect, designing spaces where families could grow and memories could be made. The irony isn't lost on me that the family space I created for myself would eventually become the center of such betrayal. My career was successful by any measure. I worked on everything from cozy family homes to sleek office buildings across Manhattan. That's how I was able to afford our apartment, overlooking Central Park. $1 million might sound like a lot, but in New York City, it bought us a beautiful but modest two-bedroom with a view that took your breath away. Eleanor, my wife of 40 years, and I purchased it when we were just starting out. We scraped together everything we had for the down payment back when the neighborhood was still up and coming. Over the decades, as the property values soared, we had opportunities to sell and move somewhere larger, but Eleanor always refused. "This is where we brought Frank home as a baby," she would say. "This is where our life happened." Frank was our only child, born after years of trying. From the moment he arrived, he became the center of our universe. I can still picture him taking his first steps across our living room, heading straight for the large windows as if drawn to the view of the park below. As a toddler, he would press his small palms against the glass and watch the tiny figures of people walking below, completely mesmerized. I worked hard to provide Frank with every opportunity. When he showed an interest in business rather than architecture, I supported him completely. Eleanor and I paid for his education at an expensive private university, covered the rent for his first apartment in the city, and even helped with the down payment for his first home when he married Diana 10 years ago. Diana was 10 years younger than Frank, stunningly beautiful with long auburn hair and a smile that could light up a room. At first we were charmed by her, though Eleanor had her reservations. "She seems more interested in Frank's potential than who he is," my wife whispered to me after they announced their engagement. I dismissed her concerns as the typical worries of a mother seeing her son move on to start his own family. The first few years after they married, Frank still visited regularly. He would come for Sunday dinners, sometimes with Diana, sometimes alone when she had prior commitments. I noticed the subtle changes in his behavior, how he would check his watch more frequently during our conversations, how his calls became shorter and less frequent. At the time, I chalked it up to the natural evolution of a relationship as a son builds his own life. When Eleanor was diagnosed with cancer 5 years ago, Frank seemed to step up. He visited more often during her treatments, brought flowers, and called to check in. Diana came less frequently, always with some excuse about work or social obligations. During Eleanor's final weeks, when we knew the end was coming, she made me promise something. "Don't sell the apartment, Homer," she said, her voice weak but determined. "This is where we built our life together. This is where you should stay." I promised her I would keep it, and I meant it with all my heart. After Eleanor passed, the apartment felt both empty and full at the same time. Empty of her physical presence, but filled with memories of our life together. Every corner held some reminder of her. The kitchen where she loved to cook Sunday roasts, the living room where we would dance to old records after Frank went to bed, the small study where she would read for hours while I worked on designs at my drafting table. Frank's visits became less frequent after the funeral. When I called him, he always seemed rushed, distracted. "Sorry, Dad. I'm really busy with work right now. I'll try to come by next weekend," became his standard response. Next weekend would come and go without a visit. When he did come, Diana rarely accompanied him. About a year after Eleanor's death, I started noticing changes in Frank and Diana's lifestyle through social media posts and the few times we did get together. They took expensive vacations to exotic locations, Diana was always wearing new designer clothes, and Frank mentioned investments in startups that sounded risky to my more conservative financial mind. During one dinner at their house, I overheard Diana complaining to a friend about their cash flow problems despite their apparent wealth. When I asked Frank about it later, he brushed it off. "Just temporary, Dad. I've got some big deals coming through soon." Meanwhile, I was adjusting to life as a widower. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking long walks through Central Park each morning, and even began learning to cook for myself using Eleanor's old recipes. I was finding my independence again, creating a new rhythm to my days that kept the loneliness at bay. That seemed to bother Frank for some reason. "Dad, don't you get lonely in that big apartment all by yourself?" he would ask, despite the fact that by Manhattan standards it was hardly big. "Have you thought about moving somewhere more manageable? Maybe a retirement community where you'd have people your own age around?" I always replied the same way. "This is home, Frank. This is where your mother and I built our life. I'm not ready to leave it." Diana made no secret of her disdain for our apartment whenever she did visit. "It's so outdated," she would say, eyeing the furniture Eleanor and I had carefully selected over the years. "You could get a fortune for this place if you renovated it or just sold it as island. Think about it, Homer. You don't need all this space." But I did need it. I needed the memories it held, the comfort of familiar surroundings, and the independence it represented. What I didn't need was to be treated like I was already 1 foot in the grave, incapable of making my own decisions. I was only 68, in good health, with a sharp mind, and plenty of life left to live. The subtle push toward a retirement home felt less like concern for my well-being and more like something else, something I wasn't yet ready to name. As months passed, the distance between Frank and me grew wider. His visits, once monthly, dwindled to once every few months. When he did come, Diana rarely joined him, and when she did, her criticisms of my home became more pointed. "This kitchen is so outdated, Homer. Those cabinets must be from the 80s, she said during one visit, running her manicured finger along my countertop with distaste. "And that carpet in the bedroom should have been replaced years ago." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that her opinion didn't matter. This was my home, filled with things Eleanor and I had chosen together. The cabinets might be old, but they held dishes we'd eaten countless family meals on. The carpet had been the spot where Frank had played with his toys as a child. Frank's suggestions about my living situation became more frequent and forceful. "Dad, I really think you should consider downsizing. This place is too much for one person to maintain," he said one evening as we finished dinner. "I'm managing just fine," I replied, gesturing to the home-cooked meal I'd just served him. "I'm active, I have friends in the building, and I'm not having any trouble keeping up with the place. But what about when you get older? What about falls or medical emergencies? You're all alone here." "I'm not exactly decrepit, Frank," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "My neighbor Thomas checks in on me regularly, and I have one of those medical alert buttons just in case." Eleanor and I planned for our future. Frank's expression hardened slightly. "Sometimes plans need to change, Dad. You need to be practical." To maintain our relationship, I started hosting small dinner parties, inviting Frank and Diana, along with some of my friends from the building and my book club. I hoped that seeing me socially active might ease Frank's apparent concerns about my isolation. During one such gathering, Diana made a comment that still stings when I think about it. "It's so quaint that Homer still cooks for himself," she said to my neighbor Thomas's wife, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Frank and I hardly have time to boil water with our schedules. We just order in or go out." Thomas, who had become a good friend since Eleanor's passing, raised an eyebrow at me across the table. Later, when we were alone washing dishes, he asked, "What's going on with Diana? She seems determined to undermine you at every turn." I shrugged, not wanting to voice my growing suspicions. "She's young. She probably can't imagine herself at our age." "There's something else going on there," Thomas said, but didn't push further. Around this time, I noticed Frank becoming increasingly interested in my financial affairs. During visits, I would catch him glancing at mail on my desk or asking casual questions about my investments or insurance policies. "Have you updated your will since Mom died?" he asked during one visit, trying to sound casual. "Harold took care of everything," I said, referring to my attorney and longtime friend. "Everything's in order." "Maybe I should take a look at it," Frank suggested, "just to make sure everything's as it should be." "Harold knows what he's doing," I replied firmly. "He's been handling my affairs for 30 years. Frank's expression darkened momentarily before he forced a smile. "I'm just trying to help, Dad." A few weeks later, Frank arrived with a folder of documents. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, spreading papers across my dining table. "I think it would be a good idea if I had power of attorney for you, just in case something happens and you can't make decisions for yourself." I stared at him, shocked by the suggestion. "Frank, I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." "For now, sure," he said, his tone patronizing. "But we should prepare for the future. It's just a precaution." "I appreciate the concern, but no thank you," I said firmly. "If the time comes when I need help, we can discuss it then." Frank's face flushed with anger. "You're being stubborn and short-sighted. This is for your own protection." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "Or is it for yours?" He left shortly after, the unsigned papers tucked back in his briefcase, his farewell curt and cold. That evening, I called Thomas and told him about Frank's suggestion. "That's concerning," Thomas said. "Power of attorney is a big deal. He could make all your financial and medical decisions." "I know," I replied. "Something doesn't feel right about it." "Trust your instincts, Homer. You're one of the sharpest guys I know." A week later, while Frank was visiting, his phone rang. He stepped onto the balcony to take the call, but I could hear the tension in his voice through the partially open door. "I told you we'd have it by the end of the month," he said, his tone urgent and stressed. "Yes, I understand the consequences." "No, please don't. We just need a little more time." When he came back inside, his face was pale, and he seemed distracted for the rest of his visit. He left earlier than usual, making an excuse about a work emergency. I began putting the pieces together. Frank and Diana's lavish lifestyle despite apparent financial strain, the increasing pressure for me to move out of my valuable apartment, the push for power of attorney. My son was in some kind of financial trouble, and it seemed he was looking to my assets as a solution. Diana's shopping addiction became more evident as I paid closer attention to their social media. Every post showed her with new designer items, standing in front of expensive restaurants, or lounging at exclusive resorts. Frank's investments, which he occasionally mentioned, seemed to be in increasingly risky ventures, as if he were desperately chasing a big payoff. During a rare dinner at their house, I noticed tension between them. Diana snapped at Frank when he suggested they might skip their annual trip to the Maldives this year. "We have appearances to maintain," she hissed, not realizing I could hear from the hallway. Frank's response was telling. "We can't maintain appearances if we're bankrupt, Diana." The final piece fell into place when Frank started suggesting more strongly that selling my apartment would be for my own good. "Property values in your area are at an all-time high right now, Dad," he said during a phone call. "If you sold, you could buy a nice little condo in New Jersey or Connecticut and have plenty left over for your retirement." "I have plenty for my retirement already," I reminded him. "And I promised your mother I would keep the apartment." "Mom would understand that circumstances change," Frank insisted. "She would want what's best for you." "And you know what that is better than I do?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "I'm just trying to help you plan for the future," Frank said, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. I realized then that I needed to be careful. Frank was becoming desperate about something, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. I needed to find out exactly what was happening before it was too late. The truth revealed itself on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in April. Frank and Diana had stopped by, unexpectedly, claiming they were in the neighborhood. I welcomed them in and offered coffee, which they accepted. When I went to the kitchen to prepare it, I deliberately took my time, listening carefully to their hushed conversation in the living room. "We need to get him to sign soon," Diana whispered urgently. "The bank won't extend the deadline again." I know," Frank replied, his voice tense. "But I can't just force him to sign over the apartment. He's my father. He's sitting on a gold mine while we're about to lose everything," Diana hissed. "The creditors are calling every day. Do you know how humiliating that is for me? This is all because of your gambling, Diana. Those girls' trips to Atlantic City weren't exactly helping our situation. Don't you dare blame this all on me." Diana's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "Your brilliant investments haven't exactly paid off either. Besides, the apartment is the perfect solution. We sell it, give your dad enough for a decent room in some retirement place, and use the rest to clear our debts." "He'll never agree to it," Frank sighed. "Then don't ask him," Diana said coldly. "The power of attorney paperwork just needs his signature. I've seen his bills. He barely looks at what he signs anymore." My hands trembled as I set the coffee mugs down. My own son and his wife were plotting to essentially steal my home from under me. I took a deep breath, composed myself, and returned to the living room with their coffee, as if I hadn't heard a word. Throughout their visit, I noticed Diana eyeing various items in my apartment, probably mentally calculating their worth. Frank seemed uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes whenever possible. They left after an hour, with Frank promising to stop by again soon with some papers for me to look at. After they left, I sat in my armchair, Eleanor's favorite reading spot, and let the tears come. How had it come to this? How had our sweet, loving son turned into someone who would conspire to push his own father out of his home? When I had composed myself, I went to my desk and began going through recent mail and documents. To my horror, I discovered several papers with what appeared to be my signature, though I had no recollection of signing them. They were preliminary documents related to property transfer and financial decisions. Frank had already begun forging my signature. With shaking hands, I called Harold, my attorney and friend of 3 decades. "Harold, I need to see you. Today, if possible." "It's urgent," I said when he answered. Something in my voice must have conveyed the severity of the situation because Harold, who normally had a packed schedule, said, "I'll be at your place in an hour." When Harold arrived, I told him everything. The overheard conversation, the forged signatures, the pressure to grant power of attorney. As I spoke, Harold's expression grew increasingly grave. "This is serious, Homer," he said when I finished. "What Frank is attempting constitutes elder abuse and fraud. He could face criminal charges." "I don't want to send my son to jail," I said quietly. "I just want to protect myself." Harold nodded understanding. "Then we need to act quickly, before he can do any real damage. First, let's look at these documents." Harold examined the papers with the forged signatures. "These are preliminary, not the actual power of attorney documents. They wouldn't hold up legally, especially with these obviously forged signatures. But the fact that he's already taking these steps is deeply concerning." "What are my options?" I asked. "Well, you could confront Frank, but given what you've overheard, that might just make him more desperate. He might try something more drastic," Harold advised. "Or we could set up some legal protections immediately and develop a counter-strategy." "What kind of counter-strategy?" Harold thought for a moment. "Frank wants to sell your apartment out from under you, correct? What if you beat him to it?" "Sell my home? But I promised Eleanor." "Eleanor would want you safe, Homer. And you don't have to leave New York. You could buy another place, somewhere Frank doesn't know about. Somewhere you could still be happy." I considered this, looking around at the apartment filled with memories. Could I really leave it behind? But then I thought of Frank and Diana's plan to put me in some retirement place with just a fraction of what my home was worth. The betrayal stung freshly. "I need to think about this," I told Harold. "Don't think too long," Harold warned. "Based on what you've told me, Frank and Diana are in a desperate financial situation. People do extreme things when they're desperate." After Harold left, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation I'd overheard, trying to reconcile the son who was plotting against me with the little boy I'd raised. Where had I gone wrong? What had happened to the values Eleanor and I had tried to instill in him? The next morning, I called Harold. "I want to know more about Diana," I said. "Something about this whole situation feels familiar, like she's done this before." Harold had connections from his years as an attorney, and within days, he had information that confirmed my suspicions. Diana had been married briefly before Frank, to an older man with considerable assets. That marriage had ended abruptly when her then-husband discovered unexplained withdrawals from their joint accounts. No charges were ever filed, but the divorce settlement was heavily in the ex-husband's favor, suggesting he had leverage of some kind. "And there's more," Harold said. "Frank's financial situation is worse than we thought. He's leveraged to the hilt, multiple mortgages on their house, maxed out credit cards, personal loans. And there are some rumors about gambling debts to people you don't want to owe money to. How could he let things get so bad?" I wondered aloud. From what I can gather, it's been a perfect storm. Diana's spending habits, some failed investments, and then trying to fix it all with increasingly risky ventures. Classic downward spiral. That night, I sat in Eleanor's reading chair, a photo of our family in happier times in my hands. "What would you do, Ellie?" I whispered to her image. There was no answer, of course. But as I sat there, I felt a sense of clarity slowly emerging. Frank was my son, and I loved him. But he was an adult, making terrible choices, and those choices were now threatening my well-being. Eleanor would want me to protect myself. She would understand that sometimes love means making difficult decisions. The next morning, I called Harold. "I'm ready to discuss that counter-strategy now," I said firmly. Harold wasted no time putting our plan into action. That same afternoon, he introduced me to Samantha, a real estate agent he had worked with for years and trusted completely. "The market is hot right now," Samantha told me, after looking around my apartment. "With your view of the park and the pre-war details, we could easily get asking price or above. But we'd need to move quickly and discreetly if you want to stay ahead of your son's plans." "How quickly?" I asked. "I have several qualified buyers looking for exactly this kind of property. If you're willing to consider off-market offers, we could potentially close within 2 to 3 weeks." It seemed surreal to be discussing selling the home I'd shared with Eleanor for decades, the home where we'd raised Frank, the home I'd promised her I would keep. But I reminded myself that Eleanor would understand. The home wasn't just the physical space, it was the life and memories we'd created there. Those would go with me wherever I went. "Let's do it," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. While Samantha began quietly showing my apartment to select buyers, Harold and I discussed where I might move. "You mentioned once that you and Eleanor talked about retiring to the coast," Harold reminded me. "Maybe now's the time to consider that." The memory surfaced immediately. Eleanor and I had visited a small coastal town in Connecticut several times over the years. We'd always said that someday, when I retired, we might buy a little house there where we could wake up to the sound of waves and spend our days walking the beach. "I think Eleanor would approve of that," I said quietly. Harold helped me search online for properties in the area. After looking at dozens of options, one caught my eye. A modest but charming 2-bedroom cottage, just 2 blocks from the beach. It had a small garden, a covered porch, perfect for reading, and large windows that would fill the space with light. At $400,000, it was substantially less than what my apartment would sell for. "It's perfect," I said. "Can we arrange to see it?" 2 days later, Harold drove me to Connecticut to view the cottage. As soon as I walked in, I felt a sense of peace. It was nothing like my Manhattan apartment, but somehow it felt right. I could picture myself there, starting this new chapter of my life. "I want to make an offer," I told the listing agent before we even left. Back in New York, things moved quickly. Samantha found a buyer willing to pay $1.2 million for my apartment, $200,000 above asking price. The coastal cottage seller accepted my offer. Both closings were scheduled for the same day, just 3 weeks away. Now came the challenging part: secretly moving my most treasured possessions to the new house, without Frank discovering what was happening. I couldn't take everything, but there were certain items I couldn't bear to leave behind. Eleanor's favorite reading chair, the quilt her grandmother had made, our wedding album, and family photos. Frank's childhood art projects that I'd carefully preserved. Thomas and his wife proved invaluable during this time. They helped me sort through decades of possessions, deciding what to take, what to store, and what to let go. On days when Frank might potentially visit, Thomas would accept deliveries of packing materials at his apartment to avoid suspicion. "You're a good friend, Thomas," I told him one evening as we carefully wrapped Eleanor's collection of antique teacups. "You would do the same for me," he replied simply. "Besides, no one deserves to be treated the way Frank is treating you." With Harold's guidance, I opened new bank accounts at a different bank and arranged for my pension and Social Security to be redirected after the move. We made sure none of the paperwork would be sent to my current address, where Frank might intercept it. As the closing date approached, I secured the majority of the money from the apartment sale, setting aside just $10,000 in my old account. I wanted to see what Frank would do when he sold the apartment out from under me. Would he really offer me just $10,000 from $1 million sale? I needed to know how far he was willing to go. The nights were the hardest. Despite my anger and hurt at Frank's betrayal, he was still my son. There were moments when I questioned what I was doing, when the weight of the deception felt too heavy to bear. On those nights, I would hold Eleanor's photo and try to draw strength from her memory. "Am I doing the right thing, Ellie?" I would ask the silence. And somehow, in that silence, I found the resolve to continue. The day of the closing arrived. I signed the papers selling my Manhattan apartment of 40 years, and, in the same afternoon, became the owner of a coastal cottage in Connecticut. The timing worked perfectly. The new owners of my apartment agreed to a 2-week rent-back period, giving me time to finish moving out after the sale was complete. That evening, I walked through the apartment, now legally no longer mine, and said goodbye to the space that had held so much of my life. Each room held memories. The kitchen where Eleanor had taught Frank to bake cookies. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents each year. The bedroom where Eleanor had spent her final days, looking out at the park she loved. "I think you would understand, Ellie," I whispered. "I think you would approve." The next day, with most of my important possessions already moved to Connecticut, I began saying goodbye to neighbors, telling them I had decided to move to be closer to the ocean in my retirement years. Most were surprised but supportive. A few, like Thomas and his wife, knew the real reason and promised to stay in touch. With Harold's help, I set up my new home, with the cherished possessions I'd brought from Manhattan. The cottage quickly began to feel like a place I could be happy. The sound of distant waves was soothing, and the small garden gave me a project to focus on. I met a few neighbors, all friendly and welcoming. "You're going to be happy here," Harold said, as we arranged Eleanor's reading chair by the largest window, where afternoon light streamed in. "I think so," I agreed. "But there's still one more thing I need to do." "Frank," Harold nodded, understanding. "I need to see his face when he thinks he's won," I explained. "I need to know if there's any remorse, any hesitation. I need to know if my son is still in there somewhere." Harold looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise? He might be angry when he realizes what you've done." "I'll be careful," I promised. "But this is something I need to do for closure." We arranged for me to return to the apartment the following weekend. Frank didn't know about my visits to Connecticut or the sale of the apartment. As far as he knew, everything was proceeding according to his plan. Now it was time to see exactly what that plan entailed. I practiced my reaction for when Frank revealed he had sold the apartment. I would act surprised and hurt initially, then gradually become resigned. I would see how little he planned to give me from the proceeds, and whether there was any guilt in his eyes when he told me I needed to leave my home. The emotional toll of knowing my son's betrayal was heavy. There were moments when I questioned whether I could go through with the confrontation, but I needed answers. I needed to know if the son Eleanor and I had raised was truly gone, or if there was still hope for reconciliation. "You don't have to do this alone," Harold reminded me. "I can be there with you." "No," I said firmly. "This needs to be between Frank and me, but I promise to call you immediately afterward." As I prepared to return to Manhattan for the confrontation, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Whatever happened next would define my relationship with my son for years to come. I only hoped that somewhere beneath the desperate man Frank had become, there might still be a glimmer of the boy Eleanor and I had raised with love. The morning of the confrontation, I returned to my apartment in Manhattan. Though I had legally sold it weeks ago, the new owners had generously allowed me a rent-back period, which meant Frank still believed it was mine. I spent the morning sitting in Eleanor's reading chair, gathering my strength for what was to come. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I took a deep breath and opened it to find Frank standing there with Diana beside him, both dressed impeccably as always. "Dad, good you're home," Frank said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Diana followed, her eyes immediately scanning the apartment as if cataloging its contents. "Frank, Diana, this is a surprise," I said, playing my part. "I wasn't expecting you today." "We have some news," Frank said, his tone businesslike. He guided me to sit on the sofa while he and Diana remained standing, a power position I recognized from my years of business meetings. "What kind of news?" I asked, noting how Diana seemed to be almost vibrating with barely contained excitement. Frank pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket and extended it to me. "I've sold the apartment, Dad." I took the envelope, my hand trembling slightly. Not from shock, as Frank likely assumed, but from the effort of containing my anger at his betrayal. "You've what?" I managed to ask, looking up at him with what I hoped appeared to be confusion. "It was for the best, Dad," Frank said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "You can't manage this place anymore. It's too big, too expensive to maintain. The new owners paid $1 million. You should be thrilled." I opened the envelope with shaking fingers and pulled out a check. $10,000 made out to me, 1% of the sale price he claimed to have received. "I don't understand," I said softly. "This is my home. How could you sell it without telling me?" Diana stepped forward, her fake concern barely masking her triumphant attitude. "Homer, we've been worried about you for so long. You're all alone here, at your age. This is really for the best." "The best for whom?" I asked, looking directly at her. Frank intervened quickly. "For you, of course. $10,000 is more than enough to secure a nice room in a retirement facility. Or, as Diana suggested, you could find a small room to rent in the outskirts. The important thing is you'll be taken care of." "Taken care of," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "And what about the rest of the money? The other $990,000? Frank shifted uncomfortably, but Diana answered without hesitation. "There were a lot of fees and expenses. And frankly, Homer, this place needed a lot of work before it could sell. We fronted all those costs." It was a blatant lie. The apartment had been well maintained, and in the current market had sold above asking price with no renovations needed. "I see," I said quietly, looking down at the check again. "And when do I need to leave?" "The new owners want to take possession next week," Frank said, seeming relieved that I wasn't putting up more of a fight. "We can help you pack the essentials. As for the furniture and other things, well, most of it is outdated anyway. The new owners might just clear it all out." I thought of the precious mementos and family heirlooms that would have been lost if I hadn't already moved them to Connecticut. The anger rose in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's very little time to pack up 40 years of memories," I observed. Frank waved dismissively. "You can't take it all anyway, Dad. Where would you put it? A room in a retirement home doesn't have space for all this stuff." "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice steady despite my roiling emotions. "We've looked into a few options," Diana said, pulling out a brochure from her purse. This place in New Jersey is affordable with the money we've given you. Basic, but clean. I took the brochure and glanced at it. The facility looked institutional and cold. Nothing like a home. The rooms were barely larger than prison cells, with shared bathrooms down the hall. This was where they wanted to warehouse me for my remaining years. This looks like a storage facility for unwanted parents, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Frank's expression hardened. We're trying to help you, Dad. You should be grateful. Grateful, I repeated. For being forced out of my home and given 1% of its value? It's not like that, Frank protested, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Then what is it like, Frank? I pressed. Explain it to me. Help me understand how this is helping me rather than helping yourselves. Diana's facade of concern slipped entirely. You're being selfish and ungrateful. Do you have any idea the financial pressure we're under? The social obligations? We need this money, and it's not like you need this whole apartment for just yourself. Frank shot her a warning look, but the truth was out now. So this is about your financial problems, I said. Not about my well-being at all. Dad, that's not fair, Frank began, but I cut him off. Not fair? You forge my signature, sell my home without my consent, try to push me into some decrepit facility, and you talk to me about what's not fair? My voice rose with each word. The argument escalated quickly. Frank became defensive, then angry. Diana didn't bother hiding her contempt anymore. You've had your life, she spat. Now it's our turn. Why should you sit on all this value when we need it? Because it's mine, I said simply. I worked for it. Eleanor and I built this life together. You have no right to take it. We have every right, Frank said, his voice cold. The paperwork is already done. The sale is final. You have 1 week to get out, or the new owners can have you removed. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for any sign of the boy Eleanor and I had raised. There was nothing there but a stranger, consumed by greed and desperation. And suddenly, I felt an unexpected emotion. Relief. Relief that I had discovered the truth before it was too late. Relief that I had protected myself from their scheme. And with that relief came a strange sense of calm. I began to laugh. Frank and Diana exchanged confused glances. Dad? Frank asked, uncertainly. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, still chuckling. Just fine. You know what? You're right. It's time for me to move on. I'll be out by the end of the week. My easy capitulation clearly surprised them. They had expected more resistance, more arguing. Well, good, Frank said, thrown off balance by my reaction. We can come help you pack if you want. That won't be necessary, I replied. I can manage on my own. They left shortly after, Diana practically bouncing with triumph, Frank looking vaguely uncomfortable but relieved. I watched them go, wondering if this would be the last time I saw my son. After they left, I sat in Eleanor's chair one last time in this apartment, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for what had been lost, anger at the betrayal, but also a strange sense of freedom. The worst had happened, and I had survived it. More than survived it. I had outmaneuvered them. I called Thomas to tell him what had happened. He really offered you just $10,000? Thomas asked, outraged. His own father? Yes, I confirmed, and a brochure for what amounts to a glorified nursing home. What are you going to do now? Thomas asked. I'm going home, I said. To Connecticut, to my new life. Do you want me to come over? Help you pack the last things? I'd appreciate that, I said. There's not much left, but some company would be nice. As I hung up, I looked around the nearly empty apartment. Most of my cherished possessions were already safely in Connecticut. What remained were just things, not the memories they represented. Those would go with me. I spent one last night in the apartment, sleeping on an air mattress, since my bed had already been moved. In the morning, I packed the few remaining items into my car with Thomas's help. "You're handling this remarkably well," Thomas observed as we loaded the last box. "I've had time to process it," I explained, "and knowing I've protected myself helps." Before leaving, I took one final walk through the empty apartment, saying goodbye to the space that had held so much of my life. In each room, memories surfaced. Eleanor dancing in the kitchen as she cooked, Frank taking his first steps across the living room, family holidays, quiet evenings, a lifetime of love and care. "Goodbye," I whispered, touching the doorframe one last time before closing the door on that chapter of my life. The drive to Connecticut was peaceful. As the urban landscape of New York gave way to the greener surroundings of Connecticut, I felt the weight of the confrontation begin to lift. I called Thomas from the road, as promised. "I'm heading to my new home," I told him. It went exactly as we expected. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. "Sad, angry, relieved. All of it at once," I admitted. "But mostly, I'm looking forward to starting this new chapter." "Have you decided if you're going to tell Frank the truth?" I sighed. "I'm going to invite him and Diana for dinner next weekend. I'll tell them then. I need to see their faces when they realize what's happened." "Do you want me to drive up? Be there for moral support?" "I appreciate that, but no. This is something I need to do myself." When I arrived at the cottage, it truly felt like coming home. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating Eleanor's reading chair positioned exactly where she would have loved it, overlooking the small garden. The sound of distant waves provided a soothing background melody. Over the next few days, I settled into my new life. I planted flowers in the garden, introduced myself to neighbors, and walked on the beach each morning. The peaceful rhythm of coastal life was a balm to my wounded spirit. As the weekend approached, I prepared for the important dinner with Frank and Diana. I called Frank midweek. "Dad, how's the packing going?" he asked, sounding distracted as usual. "It's done, actually. I've moved," I said casually. "Already? Where are you staying?" There was a note of concern in his voice, probably worried I'd spent the $10,000 on a hotel. "I'd like to show you. Why don't you and Diana come for dinner this Saturday? I'll text you the address." "Dinner?" Frank sounded confused. "Are you staying with friends?" "Something like that," I replied vaguely. "Saturday at 6? Sure. We can make that work." I spent Saturday preparing a special meal, the kind Eleanor used to make for family celebrations. A roast with all the trimmings, her famous apple pie for dessert. I set the table with our family china that I'd carefully brought from the apartment and placed fresh flowers in the center. At precisely 6, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and opened the door to find Frank and Diana standing there, their expressions shifting from expectation to confusion as they took in the charming cottage behind me. "Dad?" Frank asked uncertainly. "What is this place?" "This is my new home," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Please, come in." They walked inside, Diana's eyes widening as she took in the tasteful furnishings, the view of the garden, the obvious quality of the property. "I don't understand," Frank said, turning to me. "How can you afford this? The check we gave you wouldn't cover a down payment on a place like this." "All in good time," I replied. "Let's have dinner first, shall we?" Throughout the meal, both Frank and Diana were uncharacteristically quiet, glancing around the cottage with increasing confusion and, in Diana's case, barely concealed envy. I maintained a polite conversation, asking about their work and lives as if nothing unusual had happened between us. As I served Eleanor's apple pie for dessert, Frank finally broke. "Dad, I don't understand what's going on. How are you affording this place? Where did you get the money?" I set down my dessert fork and looked at my son directly. "I sold the apartment," Frank. "What?" "No, I sold the apartment," Frank insisted. "No, son. I sold it 3 weeks ago for $1.2 million. The new owners granted me a rent-back period, which is why you still thought it was mine when you came to tell me about your supposed sale." The color drained from Frank's face. Diana's mouth fell open in shock. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "The paperwork was forged. I finished for her. Just like you were planning to forge my signature on the power of attorney documents. But I beat you to it." I stood and went to my desk, returning with the closing documents from my apartment sale and the purchase agreement for the cottage. I laid them in front of Frank. 1.2 million for the apartment, 400,000 for this cottage. The rest is in investments and savings for my actual retirement, not the storage facility for unwanted parents you had in mind for me. Diana's face contorted with anger. "You had no right," she exclaimed. "No right," I repeated calmly. "To sell my own property? To protect myself from being defrauded by my own family? I think you'll find I had every right." "You tricked us," Diana accused. "No, Diana. I protected myself from your trick. There's a difference." Frank was staring at the documents, his expression a mix of shock and shame. "Dad, I know about the gambling debts, Frank," I said quietly. "I know about the financial pressure you're under. I know you were desperate. What I don't know is how you could do this to me, to your father, to the man who raised you and supported you your entire life." Diana stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. We're leaving." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but Frank remained seated, still staring at the documents. "Frank," Diana called sharply. "We're going. Now." Frank looked up at me, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes. Regret? Shame? It was gone too quickly to be sure. "Dad, this isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He stood and followed Diana to the door. I watched them go, Diana storming ahead while Frank followed more slowly. Just before he closed the door, Frank paused and looked back at me, a question in his eyes that he couldn't bring himself to ask. After they left, I sat in Eleanor's chair, looking out at the garden, where the evening light cast long shadows. I felt oddly calm. The confrontation was over. The truth was out. Now we would see what, if anything, remained of my relationship with my son. I hadn't told Frank about the forged signatures I'd discovered, or the legal implications of what he'd attempted. I hadn't threatened to report him or pursue legal action. I had simply shown him that I was not the helpless old man he had taken me for. The rest was up to him. To my surprise, the landline rang about an hour later. It was Frank. "Diana's gone to her sister's for the night," he said without preamble. "Can I come back? To talk?" I hesitated only briefly. "Yes," I said. "I think we should talk." 30 minutes later, Frank returned alone. He looked deflated, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. "I owe you an explanation," he said as I let him in. "Yes, you do," I agreed. "But more than that, you owe me the truth. All of it this time." We sat in the living room, the remnants of our abandoned dinner still on the table. Frank stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "It started with some bad investments," he began. "I was trying to make a name for myself in venture capital, but I backed the wrong startups. Then Diana started gambling during her weekend trips with friends. She said it was just for fun at first, but it quickly became more serious." "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. "I would have helped if I could." Frank's laugh was bitter. "Pride, I guess. I wanted to fix it myself, prove I could handle it. But things just kept getting worse. We remortgaged the house, maxed out credit cards. Then Diana borrowed money from some people you don't want to owe money to, and selling my apartment seemed like the solution." Frank nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "It wasn't my idea at first. Diana suggested it, said you didn't need all that space anyway, that we'd be helping you by moving you somewhere more appropriate for your age." "And you believe that?" I asked, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. "I wanted to believe it," Frank admitted. "It was easier than admitting what we were really doing." He finally looked up at me. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that doesn't begin to cover it, but I am truly sorry." In that moment, Looking at my son's face, I saw the little boy Eleanor and I had raised. He was still in there, beneath the desperate man he had become. "Why the $10,000, Frank?" I asked. "Why such a small amount? That's what hurts the most. Not that you wanted to sell the apartment, but that you valued my future, my comfort. So little." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "The debts are bad, Dad. Really bad. Diana convinced me you would be fine with 10,000. That at your age, you wouldn't need much more." He shook his head. I knew it was wrong. I knew Mom would be ashamed of me. But I was so desperate, I convinced myself it was okay. The honest conversation continued late into the night. Frank revealed the full extent of his financial troubles and Diana's role in their downward spiral. I listened, asked questions, and finally shared how deeply his betrayal had hurt me. "I never thought my own son would see me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited," I said. "That's the part I'm struggling to forgive." "I understand," Frank said quietly. "I wouldn't blame you if you never forgave me." As our conversation wound down, Frank asked the question that had been hanging between us. "Where do we go from here, Dad?" "That depends on you," I replied honestly. "I still love you, Frank. You're my son. Nothing changes that. But trust has been broken, and it won't be easily rebuilt." "I want to try," Frank said. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing to give me one, I want to try to be the son you and Mom raised me to be." I nodded, too emotional to speak for a moment. "It would mean establishing new boundaries," I finally said. "And I think you need to get help for your financial situation. Real help, not quick fixes." "Diana won't agree to that," Frank said, his expression troubled. "Then you have some difficult decisions to make," I replied, "about what kind of life you want and who you want to share it with." Frank left shortly after, promising to call soon. I watched him drive away, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Hurt and betrayal were still there, but alongside them was a small, fragile hope that perhaps something of our relationship could be salvaged from the wreckage of his choices. In the weeks that followed, Frank and I began the slow, challenging process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy. The trust that had been broken couldn't be restored overnight, and there were difficult conversations still to be had. Frank called me the day after our talk to let me know he had an appointment with a financial counselor. "It's time to face this head on," he said. "No more quick fixes or desperate measures." Diana, however, was not on board with Frank's new approach. "She says I'm choosing you over her," Frank told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "That I'm betraying her by admitting what we did was wrong." "What do you think?" I asked. "I think I'm finally trying to do the right thing," Frank replied. "And if she can't support that, then maybe we have bigger problems than I realized." A month after our confrontation dinner, Frank called to tell me he and Diana were separating. "She refused to get help for the gambling," he explained. "And when I wouldn't agree to her latest scheme to get money, she said I wasn't the man she married." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted my son's marriage to end. "I'm not," Frank said quietly. "I'm starting to see clearly for the first time in years how toxic our relationship was, how I let her influence me to do things I never would have considered on my own, things that betrayed everything you and Mom taught me." Meanwhile, my new life in Connecticut continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. I joined a local book club, volunteered at the community garden, and made new friends who knew nothing of my past troubles. There was a freedom in that fresh start, in being known simply as Homer, the retired architect who made excellent apple pie using his late wife's recipe. Thomas and his wife visited from New York, marveling at how quickly I'd settled into coastal life. "You seem happier here than you were in the city," Thomas observed as we walked along the beach, more at peace. "I am," I agreed, "though I still miss Eleanor every day. I think she would have loved it here." "She would have," Thomas nodded. "But more than that, she would be proud of how you handled everything, how you protected yourself without becoming bitter." That was the surprising part. Despite the hurt and betrayal, I hadn't allowed bitterness to take root. I had acted to protect myself, yes, but I had also left the door open for reconciliation. Eleanor would indeed have approved of that. 3 months after moving to Connecticut, I invited Frank to stay for a weekend. He arrived looking better than he had in years. Less stressed, more like the son I remembered. "The financial counseling is helping," he told me as we grilled fish on the back patio. "I'm on a strict repayment plan for the debts. It'll take years, but at least I can see a way forward now." "That's good," I said. "I'm proud of you for facing it." Frank looked at me, surprise evident in his expression. "You're proud of me? After what I did?" "I'm proud of you for taking responsibility and making amends," I clarified. "That takes courage." Later that evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Frank asked the question I'd been expecting. "Dad, can you ever really forgive me?" I considered this carefully before answering. "Forgiveness is a process, not an event," I finally said. "I'm working on it every day. The fact that you're working to make amends helps." "I'll never be able to make up for what I almost did to you," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "No, you won't," I agreed. "But that's not the point of making amends. It's not about erasing the past. It's about creating a different kind of future." As the months passed, our relationship slowly healed. Not to what it had been before, but to something new, something with clearer boundaries and more honest communication. Frank continued his financial counseling, took a second job to pay down his debts faster, and eventually finalized his divorce from Diana. I continued building my life in the coastal community. I made new friends, particularly Lillian from my book club, a widow with a sharp wit and kind eyes who loved walking on the beach as much as I did. My relationship with Frank evolved into something more balanced, a friendship between adults, rather than the increasingly unhealthy parent-child dynamic it had become. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this was about autonomy and respect. As we age, we don't become less deserving of dignity and self-determination. If anything, our lifetime of experience should earn us more respect, not less. Frank had made the common mistake of confusing my advanced age with diminished capacity, assuming that because I was older, I was less able to make decisions for myself. The other profound lesson was about the nature of family bonds. They're resilient, but not unbreakable. They require maintenance, honesty, and mutual respect. When Frank violated my trust, he damaged our relationship in ways that could never be completely repaired. But that didn't mean we couldn't build something new from the pieces. One evening, nearly a year after moving to Connecticut, Frank and I sat on my porch watching the waves in comfortable silence. He had come for one of his monthly visits, a tradition we had established during our reconciliation process. "You know," he said suddenly, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, trying to understand how I could have convinced myself that what Diana and I were planning was okay. And," I prompted when he paused, "I think I stopped seeing you as a person with your own life and dreams. I started seeing you as an extension of myself, a resource rather than my father. It was easier to justify taking advantage of you that way." I nodded, appreciating his insight. That's what happens when we stop seeing the humanity in others, when we reduce them to what they can give us rather than who they are. Frank looked out at the horizon. "I'm still ashamed of what I almost did, what I would have done if you hadn't outsmarted me." "Good," I said simply. "That shame will help you make better choices in the future." He turned to me, surprised. "You're not going to tell me not to feel ashamed?" "No," I replied. "Some shame is appropriate when we've done something shameful. The key is not letting it define you or paralyze you. You use it to grow, to do better." Frank nodded slowly. "I'm trying to do better, every day." "I know you are," I said. "That's why we're sitting here together." As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. I had refused to be a victim, even when the potential abuser was my own son. That strength, that self-respect, was Eleanor's greatest gift to me, and one I hope to pass on to others through sharing my story. The true value of family isn't in property or money, or even in the absence of conflict. It's in respect, in seeing each other as full human beings, worthy of dignity and autonomy. It's in loving each other enough to establish boundaries when needed, and to work on rebuilding trust when it's broken. Sometimes losing what you thought was important, like my Manhattan apartment, helps you find what truly matters. For me, that was self-respect, new beginnings, and the courage to stand up for myself, even when it was painful to do so. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who wasn't treating you right? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Remember, it's never too late to start a new chapter, to set healthy boundaries, or to reclaim your independence. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the courage to stand up for yourself when life calls for it.